Hello, commentary fans. This is your host, Mike, again, and I am back for the next commentary. And today we're going to do something a tad different, a little similar in spirit, though. We're going to do the James Cagney, Lon Chaney biopic, Man of a Thousand Faces, from 1957. It's an interesting movie. It's just kind of a biopic, and it sort of falls into the traps a lot of biopics have. But it's an important movie in the history of kind of the genre films that we all love. And at its best moments, I think it's a pretty interesting look at the times, not necessarily the life of Lon Chaney, but definitely sort of the times he was involved with. It's a film that has inspired a lot of makeup artists, and it certainly inspired me as a kid. It's definitely a movie that loves movie making, and I hope you guys enjoy the commentary. I'm paused on the first sort of title screen of the movie, Universal International special release for Hollywood's Golden Jubilee, and I am going to start the picture in 3, 2, and 1. The movie is just beginning. It has Jim Cagney as Lon Chaney, and I don't know how inspired the choice of having Jim Cagney was in the film, just because at this point he's a little too old for the part. The film starts on August 27th, 1930, which we're about to see, and we're going to meet Robert Evans, the famous head of MGM, who produced such classic movies like The Godfather, and he's playing Irving Thalberg, the head of MGM, and it's really kind of fitting because he, of course, is very much became the next generation's Irving Thalberg, and there's a bust of Lon Chaney at the Phantom of the Opera stage, which is still there on the Universal lot. The set actually still exists, which is kind of cool. It's the oldest surviving film set, and the bust is kind of awkward here. It looks like a combination of Lon Chaney and James Cagney, and physically the two men didn't really look all that similar. We just saw the credit for music by Frank Skinner, and we're definitely going to get into his musical score because I think it's one of the worst things about the picture. Irving Thalberg here is kind of giving a eulogy about Chaney and sort of talking in a very romantic viewpoint on acting. Chaney died pretty young at the age of 47, and I don't think anyone was sort of expecting it. He had been sort of private about his affairs, and he had been dying of lung cancer for about a year. And he was a very private man, which is one of the things sort of going against this picture. You know, we're gonna talk about the biopic because that's certainly, they've become a formula, you know what I mean? And pretty much, I think every biopic sort of does either two things. They look for the negative aspects of the character. I know a biopic that was pretty recent and pretty successful was the Johnny Cash biopic, Walk the Line, and I use it as sort of a template because it is one of the most successful biopics, but it falls into these traps. You know, it is only concerned about the sex life and the demons of the person. And of course, you know, that is only one aspect of someone's life. If you focus too much on that, you don't get a sense of who the person really was. And this movie falls into that trap. It focuses on Chaney's demons, and I sort of use that in a loose form because Chaney's demons in this picture really have to do with one thing: the fact that he was born to deaf-mute parents in Colorado, and it's an important part of Chaney's life. Don't get me wrong; it's definitely shaped him as a man and as an actor, but it's definitely, Lon Chaney was more than that. And the movie, I think, tries to show Chaney as sympathetic and, you know, this great, kind of this great voice for the different, and he certainly was, don't get me wrong, but unlike Lon Chaney, I don't quite think this movie respects what it is to be different in a way. I think it ostracizes different people in the guise of celebrating them. And that's not what Lon Chaney was. Here are the best moments of the movie. I guess in one way you can say that James Cagney was a good choice to play Lon Chaney because both men had a very similar background in terms of building themselves as artists. Chaney and Cagney had a great amount of vaudeville experience, and you certainly see that Cagney is right at home in this moment, playing the clown on the stage, and Cagney also has a great use of pantomime. His face here is incredible. He's a good clown, I think, in these two sequences on the vaudeville stage because there's a tragic nature to this clown as well. Chaney, of course, was sort of certainly had experience in clowning. I'd imagine he did do a great amount of it on the vaudeville stage, but in my opinion, his best film is a picture called He Who Gets Slapped, which is an adaptation of the Russian play. And Chaney plays a take on the Pagliacci myth. And there are moments in that movie that really make you laugh and cry at the same time. And it shows the fact that it takes a lot of dignity to play a clown, because they are sort of pathetic in some ways. Here we have Cagney. His mannequin has fallen down, and the bit ends with a big frown on his face. Lon Chaney traveled the country going from vaudeville theater to vaudeville theater, and I like the opening of this picture because it shows kind of this dire straits some of these performers had. You know, they really had to be committed to their craft, because often they'd be paid in peanuts, like Cagney says they're potato peelings, and what he says here is that they need to find other shows. Vaudeville was the popular form of entertainment at the time, of course, because this takes place before motion pictures. And so every sort of theater, I mean every sort of town would have a vaudeville act come through. And that's how Chaney got started and made a name for himself. And, you know, you look at Lon Chaney and Jim Cagney even, and you see that when they came to their motion picture career, they kind of found themselves stuck in one thing, you know, Chaney playing these misfits and Cagney playing these hard-edged tough guys, and you know, both of them had range because they needed to. Chaney was, I've read that he was described as sort of a jack of all trades. He really had to be. He had experience, of course, in clowning, singing, stand-up comedy, and dancing especially. I've heard he was a great dancer. It's a shame that he didn't do it in any of his movies. Here we have the first instance of Cleva, who is Lon's first life, and she's played here by Dorothy Malone, who's sort of I don't know, I don't think you'd call her a femme fatale, but she's definitely very overdramatic. Her part very hard. And she plays Cleva, Lon's first wife, and I'd have to think that, you know, in adapting Chaney's life to screen, this is one of the things that got sort of lost in the translation. And this part in the movie, Chaney is only about 22 years old, and he's played here by a 57-year-old Cagney, and it's hard to remember that. And Chaney, married Cleva Creighton when she was 15 years old, and she married or she had Lon Chaney Jr. or Creighton Chaney when she was only 16, and so I'd have to imagine that a lot of the conflict of their marriage had to do with the fact that they were both so young at the time, and the fact that they lived a very odd life. And of course, they were traveling across the country, not knowing when the next pay check would be. Lon's parents were deaf mutes, and it's really kind of fascinating to really think about Chaney's upgrading. Lon Chaney, obviously, the ability he had to showcase the sort of different, a lot of people naturally assume that came from knowing what persecution his parents faced. They met when Lon's mother's parents formed a school for the deaf in Colorado Springs, which actually still exists. And Chaney, of course, was proficient in sign language, and a large part of sign language is being able to communicate not only with your hands but with your face. And how perfect is that in becoming an actor. We have Lon's parents here, and they serve as the conflict of the story in terms of the effect that they have on Cleva Creighton and her fear that her son is going to be born deaf mute. And I think that's really just a very very simple choice that really plays into melodrama, and it is very disappointing. And it doesn't even work on. I don't think it works in the way that the film intends it to, because you really are encouraged, I'd imagine, to identify with Lon as, what he was, a great voice for the different. But even here, he's not very sympathetic to his first wife. He doesn't tell her that his parents were deaf, and that you could see why someone would be frustrated with that. I mean, I don't think they'd have the reaction that Cleva had, but it is sort of unsympathetic.
All right, let's see now. No prompting. Mom, white meat. Dad, dark and heavy on the gravy. John and curry. Drumsticks or wings. Enjoyed because you're the baby of the family. Last part over the fence.
Yeah, here we have the music by Frank Skinner, and it's just way over the top. Like, it goes into these over dramatic cues. Like, it's almost stock. There's like a dun 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 kind of feel to these cues here when Cleva acts up. And then you remember that heroic sort of theme at the beginning of the picture where they introduce Irving Thalberg. It just is really too simple in a way, too predictable, and it just, I think in the long run, it insults the intelligence of an audience. You know what I mean? Like, why would you need this kind of overpowering musical score? I mean, audiences are smart enough. You got to respect them, and you got to let them. They have, I'm sorry. You have to be able to use your imagination in a way, and then if you just have this overpowering, it just is really jarring. And Dorothy Malone just goes into eccentric here. She just screams at the top of her lungs, and that just is punctuated with this musical score. It's just too much. Obviously less is more. And even though I don't really like the dialogue or the conflict here, I suppose it would work better had it just been smaller, without that grand orchestral theme and without Malone screaming at the top of her lungs. Chaney's mother is played by a woman named Celia Lovsky, and you have the music surrounding her, which I almost think is sort of offensive in some way. It's very, I don't know how I would just say it. It's sort of, I would say condescending. It's supposed to make her almost religious, I would say. She sort of reminds me of kind of a Mother Mary sort of figure. And, for someone who's playing a deaf mute, her face is very sort of stagnant. It's really, it's just as over dramatic as those big moments in the picture. And it's hard, really, because you're supposed to identify with these characters and see them as human beings. But you see them as human beings, but they you hear Lon here talking about what it means to be different. But it isn't enough to go into respecting the differences. I think what Lon Chaney did was look for the similarities. They were, even the most eccentric characters that Chaney played, they all had a very human desire to be loved. And we have the lines of dialogue here where Chaney says that kids were tagging after his mother and father, who were so proud that they could speak, they had to be cruel. And there's such a thing as being condescendingly accepting of disabilities. And I think that this film sort of is in that way. But No, it's a process. Uh, it's a process. I mean, I imagine that this film was the first one to really humanize deaf mutes, and so it's good to. I mean, it's good to see that in some ways, but you'd wish that there's the evolution over time, and at least it showcases this aspect of Chaney's life. We were just introduced to Jim Backus, who is of Gilligan's Island fame, and he's playing Clarence Locan, Chaney's pal, and eventually he becomes his press agent. Here we have Clarence Dill playing his self. He's of Colbandale, which was an actual variety show that Chaney was a part of. Where did you learn it? Parents, show business, deaf.
Don't let it bother you, Mr. Dill. Doesn't bother them.
Actually, the movie, I think one of its glaring inaccuracies in showcasing Chaney's life is that it doesn't quite respect the fact that Chaney actually didn't really have a home during his theatrical years. I mean, the beginning is kind of neat how it shows, you know, the water in the dressing room, the leaky stage and stuff, and that's more in tune to what Chaney probably did. I believe Colbandale was just one of the stops during his career, and it's just because it's the most prestigious one that they sort of give it a little bit more airtime.
That's the point. I don't really want to hear it. I'd rather talk.
I've heard stories that Chaney, you know, he traveled the country, and eventually when he had his son, Creighton Chaney, Lon Chaney Jr., he'd bring him along, and they'd actually would, you know, Chaney would perform street shows or pianos at like a bar, and he'd have Creighton Chaney, you know, pickpocket sandwiches and stuff. And so, you know, it just shows you how committed he was to being an actor and how the life of an actor really was at this time.
Or would that have been too long? Is that it, Lon? Are you trying to get me used?
Are you trying to get me used to the silence? See, this is one of the problems of the film, is that it,
I can't. I'm scared.
like I said earlier, it's a biopic, and so it's only concerned with the demons and the women in his life, and, you know, Cleva serves as both. Like, you don't really see the beginnings of their marriage and how they fell in love. It goes straight into the troubles that they have, and I don't even think that these were the real troubles of their marriage. It's just this one issue of her hating Lon's parents, sort of being brought forth to utmost extremities. and her fear of Creighton being born deaf, which, it doesn't really hold up all that well, because Creighton is born here, and they've discovered that he's not deaf, so how are they going to continue this storyline? You know what I mean? The Cheneys, from what I've read, were a very old-fashioned family. They were very close, obviously, and they had sort of a conservative, I would guess, definition of family, with the man being held head as the household. I think that might have been what was what doomed this first marriage. Cleva Creighton was sort of a, I would say, chorus girl singer, and she flirted with the men, and I think that is what is sort of the what made that marriage fail. A great book to read about Lon Chaney is The Man Behind the Thousand Faces by Michael Blake. It really does the best job you could do in sort of exploring Lon Chaney as a person. It was written in the late 80s, and Blake really took the time in investigating the people who were still with us then, who had worked with Chaney or had known him, and knew him as a person. And the thing about Lon Chaney is that I don't really know how interesting he was as a actual man. I mean, certainly his beginnings are interesting with his family, and they certainly shaped him as an artist, but, there's such a thing as being a much more interesting artist than a person. By all accounts, he was, just a pretty normal guy. There's a lot of legends about Chaney, because he was private, people sort of create their own interpretations of him, and certainly with the characters he played, it's easy to sort of assume things and, plant in your own ideas. And that was, part of the appeal of Lon Chaney, because he was, so private. People would, fill in the blanks, so to say, and that's, part of the fun. Your imagination is greater than anything that actually happened, and that, is certainly a part of his makeup. One of the popular rumors is that Chaney was somewhat masochistic in the makeup, and that probably, that's so far from the truth, but you'd have to imagine that in some ways that was sort of encouraged, because, how more horrible people's imaginations are, the more into the performances they'll be. Here we are introduced to Jane Greer, who plays Hazel Hastings, who eventually becomes Chaney's second wife. And, since this movie makes such easy choices. You know, she's obviously a saint in comparison to Cleva. I like this scene here where Creighton is has the chorus girls as his babysitters, because it probably is true, and it's certainly an interesting part of things.
I'll take care of him while you're on. He's my new fellow. That's it.
Here, Creighton in his little sailor suit. About to see Cagney perform another pantomime, which is sort of in the spirit of what Chaney did. He's playing a character called Old Lady Mercatoy. And he does a pretty good job with it. I like how the little boy says, show me a story. It's so sweet, and definitely, you know, is a very romantic view of Lon Chaney, and really just in silent films in general, because that's what they were, you know, showing a story. You know, the only thing is that when Chaney, or when Cagney plays the part, he actually does some vocalizations. They wanted to go full into it. It really, you know, wouldn't want it. And this is one of the better pieces in the film, because I think it's closer to what Chaney would have done, or the actual Lon Chaney would have done. You know, it showcases how expressive the face could be, and you know, just how you know, just with just a wig, you know, you see Cagney sort of go into the mannerisms of an old woman, and it's enough to, I mean, you know, obviously you don't believe that he is what he is. It's a very exaggerated, but it feels real, and it certainly feels very sweet. And there's very committed choices here. He's sewing the fingers, and he actually wraps them around, and he actually, you know, makes very committed choices and goes all out with it. Cagney, of course, was in Yankee Doodle Dandy, and playing George M. Cohan, and he's very good in that film too. It's also about the sort of the economic, or the sort of popular entertainment at the time, and I think that's probably the appeal of playing Lon Chaney to him, because it was about kind of his own sort of roots too. Universal produced this film, and I would suppose that you'd want to know a little bit about Universal's relationship with Lon Chaney. I think it's kind of ironic that it's Universal who made this film, because Universal let Lon Chaney go. He, right around the time in his career when he was starting to get popular, and he was making a name for himself and getting billing, and he went to Universal and asked for a raise, of all things, and he was told that he'd never be worth a raise, and so he became a freelancer. He'd return to Universal for Hunchback and Phantom, but the bulk of his success and the best roles he got were actually from MGM, who I think appreciated Chaney's talents a lot better than Universal did. Looking back at Lon Chaney, I think a lot of people fail to understand what he really was. And if I were to look at Lon Chaney and say what I thought he was, I would say I thought he was the world's first, or not the world's first, but cinema's first great character actor. I think if I were to look at him and say who his modern day equivalent would be, I'd probably say Gary Oldman. Like Chaney, Gary Oldman has been able to be the star of pictures despite playing character roles, and I think more importantly he's played non-romantic roles. Chaney never played a traditional leading man or hero, and also he never really played a traditional villain either. His films never really were confined to that stereotype. Around this time, there was a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. It was written and published by Forrest J. Ackerman, and I'm pretty sure if you've followed the other commentaries I've had, you'll know and appreciate Forrest J. Ackerman and what he did. He wrote these magazines. He wrote these magazines that celebrated the classic monster films, and he was a huge Chaney fan. I don't think he knew all that much about Lon Chaney's life, or I don't think he studied his films quite as much. He really was in love with Phantom and Hunchback, and kept promoting them as the first and the best horror films. And they kind of got a mythical sort of status because of the fact that when they were published in the 50s, there wasn't a home video. And even now, Lon Chaney's films are sort of hard to find. Like, you have to seek them out on bootlegs a lot of the times. Just right now, only recently, the catalog of the surviving MGM titles have been released on DVD-R, of all things. now they're now you're able to sort of find them a little bit. But before you couldn't, and certainly not then you couldn't either. And so what people had were the stills that Forrest J. Ackerman would publish in his magazine. Every issue of famous Monsters of Filmland had a feature called Lon Chaney Shall Not Die, and it's a good idea, and it, certainly is very powerful. It's certainly a very powerful idea, or it's a great selling point, and it turned Lon Chaney into a legend for horror fans, and that is like the first instance where he became a horror icon, and he isn't, or I mean, I suppose he is, but that's not what he was best at all. I make no apologies for the fact that I am a horror fan, and I love the horror films from right after Lon Chaney, God knows. And I love Lugosi, I love Karloff, I love Chaney Jr. All three of them were great horror actors, and they were all very talented. But Lon Chaney was talented in a very different way. Of course, what got me to initially look into the films of Lon Chaney was my curiosity for seeing another great horror film, and I was pleasantly surprised. Honestly, I think the horror films, the supposed horror films that Chaney made aren't all that interesting in the grand scheme of things. And
Damn you! Damn you! Damn you!
aren't all that interesting in the grand scheme of things of his filmography. And even then, I hesitate to really call Hunchback a traditional horror film. Phantom certainly could be, and I know in the Mark of the Vampire commentary we went a great deal into the work of or the lost film London After Midnight, which its notoriety and fame is directly due to Ackerman and his Lon Chaney Shall Not Die segment.
I couldn't leave the boy!
Here we have a melodramatic moment where we meet Carl Hastings, Hazel's ex-husband, and we see the first sort of hints that Lon might love Hazel, and it's complete with the little musical cue, the little dun dun da that knocks us in the face. We have to see that Carl has no legs, and they sort of go into it a little later in the film when they discuss one of Chaney's best performances called The Penalty, in which he plays Blizzard, a legless criminal, and they sort of hint that he might have gotten the inspiration from here. I don't know, like this moment, it seems very theatrical. I really would be surprised if it actually happened. It goes into, though, sort of the time period of the picture and sort of the appeal that Lon Chaney's performances and characters had. Certainly Lon Chaney is one of the first actors, and maybe really one of the only actors, to really consistently play characters who were crippled or disabled. And
Was the boy getting in your way?
crippled or disabled around the time of Chaney's fame. It corresponded with the end of the First World War, and
Oh, good.
the advances in
I'm not going back to being a nursemaid. So you
the
can
advances in technology made that war the most horrific ever, but they also made it possible for people to live with the horrible injuries that were suffered on the battlefield. And so, people would come home as double amputees. They'd come home with missing eyes or pieces of the face, looking more like the Phantom of the Opera than a real person. And I think that's one of the aspects of Chaney's appeal. Gosh, how melodramatic is that performance?
Maybe I can't walk. But I'm not walking.
He's like laughing sinisterly. This is like the Inquirer on film. And, and I don't know. I guess that does have some appeal to people to see in these biopics, these goofy, over-the-top moments that show how flawed celebrities are. And it's just kind of, really, what is the appeal in that? I wonder. Does the fact that Lon Chaney had a troubled marriage, what does that do for you? Maybe, I guess you could say, is it might go into his characterizations in some ways. You might say, hey, maybe that helped him think of a character that he suffered, but really, that's, I think, part of the appeal. And it's just my personal theory, and don't quote me knowing all, but I think part of the appeal of seeing the seedier aspects is that, you could say that these celebrities aren't perfect. And whatever, it's just a part of things. I, for one, would much rather see a take on Lon Chaney's life that goes into him as an artist, that spends time with him in how he looked at people and how he developed characters, because that's a fascinating aspect of Chaney's life. He spent a lot of time watching people, and there's a great story about a film called Mr. Wu. Unfortunately, the film isn't really all that interesting. It's kind of a over-the-top thriller. it takes place in the Orient and has kind of Chaney playing Mandarin, member of high, like a old Mandarin who doesn't want to marry his daughter off to a Westerner, and it's kind of shows how the tragedy of the old culture coming into conflict with new ideas. But I digress. Chaney's makeup for it is really incredible, and certainly at a time when playing an Oriental character, a Chinese character, there would be a lot of temptation to go into stereotypes. Chaney doesn't do that, and Chaney Chaney's greatest test would be to look at the makeup and actually go out in public with it and see if people wouldn't recognize him. And the artist in Chaney, the fact that he tried that is much more fascinating, I think, than any of these tabloid episodes, dialed up to 10 for all their melodramatic qualities. And here we have probably the biggest moment in Chaney's life. We just passed it. Lon Chaney is in the hospital. Cleva has just attempted suicide. And this really happened. It was sort of what ended, well, it was what ended their marriage. Cleva ran out when Lon was on stage and swallowed some acid in an attempt to kill herself. And it permanently damaged her vocal cords. And Lon was very vengeful over this, and they got out of contact, and I guess they never saw each other again. Little Creighton was backstage when this happened, from what I've heard, and Lon Chaney Jr. obviously had a very sort of depressing life. He ventured into alcoholism, and you wonder how happy his childhood would have been, because this sort of was a horrible moment for the young man, and we'll see the repercussions of it in the actual film, because you see that little Lon Jr. gets taken away by the state because he, just seeing how this happens. This is one of the moments where the film does sort of get it historically accurate. After Cleva tries to kill herself, Lon finds himself in a position where he can't get work in a theater because of the bad publicity. Like, even then, he sort of became a pariah in the tabloids. Like, this story was too good to be true. You see a woman try to kill herself on stage. That sells papers. And so Lon finds himself in a position where he can't find work, and he figures that the motion picture industry might be able to supply him with some stability that'll give him the opportunity he needs to get work, and so he can win his son back. These are some sweet moments where we have Chaney with the little boy. This is one of the things that you don't really know all that much about Chaney's relationship with his son. Lon Jr. obviously lived the rest of his life in the shadow of his father. I mean, it really, hurt. I mean, it's really a hard act to follow when his father was one of the greatest actors in the history of motion pictures. But, we've done Lon Jr. films, and he was talented in his own right. And he was talented in a different era of film, and he played different characters than Lon Sr. And so, these comparisons aren't really all that fair. But he was asked, a great deal in interviews about his father, and the stories were very contradictory. I guess when Cagney was doing this film, he went to Lon Sr. Or he went to Lon Jr. for some advice, and I guess he told him all sorts of sordid stories about how Lon Sr. would abuse him and beat him, and I don't know how true those are. It's sad, really. You see how depressed Lon Jr. must have been. And I think this is a very romanticized view of their relationship. But, it's fascinating to think about what went on between those two, because, they're a great father-son tandem of actors, and they both had their own unique talents, but you could definitely sort of see in ways why Lon Jr. felt that some resentment towards his father. I mean, for God's sakes, he was sent to an orphanage because his father's marriage couldn't work out. And being compared to his father all the time, not being able to make a name for yourself in the same way, and when you obviously have talent, Lon Jr. is very talented, and even in some instances when Lon Jr. tried to emulate some of the techniques of his father. There's a picture called 1 Million BC, which was made in 1940 and then features caveman makeups, which are very elaborate. And I guess Lon Jr. was a very talented makeup artist in his own right. He probably studied his father and learned a great deal from him, and he tried to create his own caveman makeup and create a character in the same way, and he wasn't allowed. And so it's just tough. Here we're introduced to Old Gert, who's played by Marjorie Rambeau, who was a silent film actress in her own right, I believe, who kind of came out of retirement to sort of celebrate this film. She is goofy in this movie, you know. You listen to that voice and it just reeks of nothing but chain smoking. In actuality, she's only a few years younger than the real Lon Chaney. But she gives Cagney the advice that he doesn't have the face to be anything in movies. He's an unsaleable commodity, and of course, you know, that's the most important part of the Lon Chaney legend. The fact that he realizes that he has to look in his box to make himself wanted. Chaney started off as an extra like this, and I like this part of the picture because it goes into really what sort of movie making was at this time. You know, he did go into shadow of the vampire, you know, how movies are made at this time and how they give direction and sort of how they you know, over exaggerated. And we see Chaney here bring in his makeup box, which is the legend of Lon Chaney, which is what he's most remembered for. Not just the fact that he was a great actor, but the fact that he was a brilliant makeup artist as well. And I like this moment a lot. It's one of the few moments of the film which really goes into him as this great makeup artist in the right way. Cagney is applying makeup to himself in very much a similar way that the real Lon Chaney probably might have. This probably is what a real Lon Chaney would makeup would look like. And of course the Thousand Faces is definitely a part of it. Later on in the film, we're going to see some more extreme characterizations of Lon's makeup. But this one, I think, is probably the best. And it looks pretty authentic, really, because it does sort of look like Chaney under there.
What are you trying to do? Be a one-man crew? You heard him, Joe. He's looking for this scar.
He's looking for this scar. Yeah, that's definitely the Universal lot. I can recognize some of it from when I actually took the tour there. Chaney,
Hey, you. Yeah, Pete. I'm looking for a fellow called Chaney.
Chaney, his makeup, I think what you see with that is that there's definitely the appeal to it is that you see that it's always Chaney under that makeup. It's always Chaney under that makeup. You know, people appreciate the illusion of the makeup is just as appealing as the actual character itself. I think a big telling point of this is the fact that there's a movie called Freaks, which was made by Todd Browning, who ironically isn't characterized in this film, even though like I would consider him to be Lon's muse. They made the most amount of films together, and you know, in some ways I've heard him being called Lon Chaney's enabler, and that he would bring all these grotesque challenges for Chaney to play. But I digress. Browning, after Chaney's death, was kind of in a rut, and he makes a picture called Freaks, which is infamous for using the actual circus performers and putting them in, you know, actually playing them. But it was, of course, it was a horrible flop. And, you know, you sort of look at it and say, you know, hey, that's kind of, it's kind of similar in a lot of ways to a Lon Chaney film. I mean, you could almost say it's Freaks is a Lon Chaney film without Lon Chaney in it. But I think what you fail to realize is that it wasn't just the grotesque nature of some of these characters or the powerful makeups. It was seeing Lon Chaney and how he did them, and how he applied them, and how he would perform the part. And so, you know, in a way, he's a magician too, because you want to see how the tricks are done. And that's definitely a part of Lon Chaney, and definitely his makeups. You know, people still discuss how he would do them, and they're always fascinating to look at. I love looking at stills of Lon Chaney's makeups. You know, that's all we have left of London After Midnight, but still, it's so fascinating to look at that character. And, you know, they always aided his performance, the makeups. They never were the performance itself. I should probably go into this here. Chaney is reenacting a scene from The Miracle Man, which is the film that sort of made him a star. In the picture, he plays a con artist who can contort his body. And these group of con artists go to this faith healer so that they can profit on the people who believe in him. And Chaney, there's a scene in the film, which is the only scene that actually exists, and the only reason it does is because it was used in a greatest hits compilation, where Chaney unravels his body to the healer, and it's powerful. You know, I wish that the whole picture would be discovered, because, you know, what we have left of it is so good. I like that. He caps it off by doing a little tap dance.
All right, folks, let's break it up. Let's get ready for the next setup. Say, Lon, there's a freelance magazine writer over there who's doing a story on the picture. He wants to meet you. Dave Anderson, this is Lon Chaney. It's really something, Mr. Chaney. You ever a professional contortionist? No, just slightly. Shields is on the set piece that you talked about.
Dr. Shields is a character in this picture, and like I said, he sort of goes into the myths that Lon Chaney was something of a masochist, and how he created his role, that he actually liked having the pain of the part, and that's certainly part of the urban legend. Like we say that, people want to believe that about Lon Chaney, and I certainly see some of the appeal. I would say that the only picture that I would say that, like, the only picture where you could say that that might be true a little bit is The Penalty, where Chaney plays a double amputee, and in order to do that, he actually built a contraption where he would strap his legs to his back, and he could only do this for like short increments at a time. Otherwise, the fear would be that the blood would be cut off to his leg. But that's not what Chaney was, although I certainly imagine that it was part of the publicity campaign here, like we're seeing here, that, look at what this guy will go to. But, that's just not practical, and it's just goofy. You look at some of the pictures and of the things, and they do sort of look a little painful. The London After Midnight in particular does. They have wires almost that stretch out his eyes, and you wonder how painful that must have been. We're having the first hint of the cabin, which is an important part of the film. It actually did exist. There was a cabin that Lon Chaney built, but it isn't like it is in the picture. I mean, it existed. He bought it, and it was actually designed by Paul Williams, a famous African-American architect, who designed both the cabin and the last home that Chaney bought. And sadly, he didn't actually get to live in it. In the cabin, he wasn't even able to enjoy it for all that long. He got it just a year before he died. But it's an interesting to see it here, because it is one of the few connections we have to the real Lon Chaney. The cabin still exists today. In the woods in California. I believe it's the Sierra Woods. But unfortunately, and like, this is so disheartening, it's connected to two famous people. Chaney lived there and bought it, and Paul Williams designed it, but it's just sort of sitting and rusting out there. I believe the forest rangers use it for a shed, which is like so terrible. There's actually a movement to add it to the historical registries, and I'd certainly hope that movement gains some traction. I guess you can get there on a hike. It'd kind of be cool for sure to have a look at it. Here we have Jane Greer again as Hazel, and she was a famous actress. A lot of people remember her because she sort of became one of Howard Hughes's targets, I guess you would say, an obsessive, that man was capable of obsession, obviously greater than anyone, and I guess he was obsessed with her and loved her, and I guess you'd call it lust, really, and I heard that he ruined her marriage and whatnot, and that's really too bad. She's pretty good in this picture. She certainly has the warmth needed for the part, and even though the kind of comparison to Cleva. She's obviously kind of everything Cleva is, and it's sort of just, I don't know. I think she's really there so that they can bring Cleva back later on in the film. And it just, whatever, it's not very exciting, or not necessarily exciting, not really a great dramatic choice. It's very simple. But what I can say is that she does the best with the part. I think you'd have the certainly would have to have. I mean, you'd certainly could have had a lot worse with the part. For myself, Lon. I would wish me on anybody. Yeah, we're having that music score. It's kind of, traditional love music, and then we were seeing the first introduction of the cabin here, and Chaney and his son fishing, and Lon Chaney was a very avid outdoorsman. There's a lot of pictures of him fishing and from his family albums, and he looks happy there. He did love the outdoors and trapping and hunting, obviously living in Colorado Springs. There's a picture that he had the most involvement with called Trap, which Lon Chaney actually wrote somewhat, and it's not very good, but it just kind of shows a look into the actual man. Can't men talk about men's business about women, but again, they're doing ASL, American Sign Language, to one another. I think that's an interesting part about this movie, too. I've said earlier that I'm not overly fond of the characterization of Lon's parents. I think it's oversimplistic and melodramatic, but here we're going to see them again. But I do certainly like the fact that this film was shown to ASL audiences. It was shown that they would have subtitles for them, and that must have been an appeal to Lon Chaney in silent film acting, is that it was perfect for audiences like his mother and father. And it's really, pantomime is a universal language because the face doesn't lie, the emotions on the face don't lie. And Lon Chaney actually was one of the last actors to make the transition to sound pictures he was one of the last actors to make the transition to sound pictures, and you got to think that he saw the writing on the wall that, you know, movies were not going to be as universal anymore, and that they were going to be smaller, and the audiences they could reach culturally and certainly whatever. One of the other cruel rumors was that, you know, Lon was so private, and people began to suspect that maybe he too was deaf, and that's why he didn't make a sound picture. And how cruel is that? But that is kind of what drove him to make that sound picture, I imagine, eventually. Here's the penalty, which I was alluding to earlier. One of the great things about this picture are those drawings, which really look incredible. They showcase the look of the characters. Here they are outside the law, A Blind Bargain, which is a lost film, Oliver Twist, which he's in with Jackie Coogan, he plays Fagin. The Hun doesn't exist, that's not a real movie. Treasure Island is lost as well, but he actually plays two parts in that film. You know, it just showed his versatility, and they obviously used that to market the film. And we're reintroduced to Robert Evans as Irving Thalberg. There's a great joke here. You think he's actually the secretary, but he's really the producer. And there's, I believe, is a portrait of Carl Laemmle above that fireplace there, the head of Universal Pictures. But Irving Thalberg was called the boy genius because he was so young when he achieved all his great success. He started off at Universal as a script reader and assistant to Laemmle, and Laemmle eventually, you know, listened to his input and would take the projects he had, and he had a great vision for casting stars. Like Irving Thalberg was responsible for finding and amassing MGM's silent film talent and into the sound era. He married Norma Shear, who appears with Chaney in He Who Gets Slapped, which is his best film in my opinion, but they did work together on The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And Chaney was one of his greatest discoveries, and Thalberg was certainly a patron of his. He was I believe he was a producer on pretty much all his films at MGM, and he was responsible for, you know, bringing him to MGM, as you recognize what a talent he was. Thalberg is given some pretty good dialogue in the film, which I think in some ways describes Chaney. Obviously, we saw in the beginning of the film in his eulogy that the actor is the person that has the abilities to illuminate the dark sides of people, or, you know, show what it means to be human. And Thalberg here says, you know what it's like to be different. Make people understand. Make them see it the way you see it. Oh boy. Okay, here's a problem I certainly have with the picture, and we'll discuss this, I suppose. the makeup in this film is by a craftsman named Bud Westmore, who he created the makeup for Creature from the Black Lagoon, and he did the makeup for Abbott and Costello, Meet Frankenstein. But Westmore got his job because what he did was make makeup application a little less time-consuming. Pierce, and I would imagine Chaney as well, did everything out of the case, and they would take time to build up. Like, of course, the Frankenstein makeup had to be built up every day, from scratch, building up the cotton and collodion over one another with spirit gum. And it was very time-consuming, obviously. And so Bud Westmore comes along, and he devises the idea of creating these appliances, which of course are almost like masks, like little plastic pieces or rubber foam that they can just, I would say, put on and glue, and it cut down the Frankenstein makeup like in half. And here he is in this picture, recreating Lon Chaney's makeup. What this, it just shows the difference between a makeup man and a mask maker, because this is, I would say, really all Cagney is wearing when he recreates Quasimodo, and later on we'll see him as the Phantom. He's wearing just a elaborate mask. I mean, look at his face there. There's almost no room for acting. He can't really almost talk in it. And you see his eyes, they're completely closed over. Lon Chaney would never make a makeup that looked like that, because it inhibited him as an actor. And that's something I think that you really learn about with any makeup artists, really. Dick Jones, what was it? Dick Smith, I apologize, I sort of lost it. Dick Smith recently passed away. He did the makeup for The Exorcist, which is, of course, a legendary makeup. And he also did the makeup for The Godfather on Marlon Brando, which I think is an incredible makeup because it's subtle. You have to understand that you don't want the makeup to do your performance for you. You want the makeup, you have to have the makeup help the actor, not hinder them. I think a good case here to bring up is J. Edgar, the recent Clint Eastwood, biopic of J. Edgar Hoover, which is about J. Edgar Hoover, and it follows his entire life. And by the end of the film, all the characters are elderly, and the makeup is that they put on Leonardo DiCaprio in that film is absolutely horrible. It's just horrible. His face is stuck together, you know. It looks so false. Like he doesn't look like a person at all. And you just you want the actor to be able to act. And Dick Smith understood that. He would say that he would never create a makeup that put a fixed position on someone's face. You know, you don't want the makeup to do the acting for you. Like in some horror films, you see the makeup made into like a growl or a smirk. I would say a good example of it would be Legend, that Tim Curry film where he plays the devil-like character. You know, that's a pretty bad makeup. Some of the Stan Winston stuff had some moments like that. Batman Returns, that penguin makeup is pretty good, but you know, it looks menacing, you know, but you know, it doesn't allow Danny DeVito to really do much with his face. But you see, like Dick Smith and what he did with The Godfather is like the exact opposite of that. It's subtle, and you see him able to put a lot of himself into it with the help of that makeup. And that's what Chaney was famous for as well. A great Chaney makeup that and a great Chaney film that I think sort of gets criminally underrated is Mockery, which takes. We'll get back to that later. We got to address the Phantom of the Opera scene here. Doesn't quite have the epic scope of the original picture. You see Chaney reenacted, and it's a pretty decent reenaction. That woman looks nothing like Mary Philbin, though. But we'll see Bud Westmore's pretty awful makeup, and I think the reason you can tell it's a terrible makeup is you see that Cagney can't move his face at all. Chaney certainly could. Phantom of the Opera was an important moment in Chaney's career. It was probably the hugest picture he ever did, and it's sort of glossed over here. Like, I would think like a really good biopic of Chaney would spend a lot more time here. It certainly, you know, this movie made by Universal, it certainly is what kind of soured his relationship with Universal for good and led him to completely go to MGM. You know, we have in this movie like 3 or 4 scenes where they go to the cabin. You know, you want to see the backstage stuff. I like this little detail in all of his dressing rooms. Lon puts a caricature of himself as the character he's playing on the walls.
There's one more shot. Break them all. What's the scene? I'll wind up apologizing and doing what he wants. What star you're up to? Probably fooling around with his makeup box.
Copying one of his faces. He must have 1,000 of them in there. The man of 1,000 faces.
The man of 1,000 faces. How's that?
That's a pretty good one. It certainly has a nice ring to it. We're having the posters here. Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. Tell It to the Brains is a good one too. He's playing. There's Mockery, which I suppose I'll get into. West of Zanzibar. The Unknown, which is the best picture he did with Todd Browning. London After Midnight. They actually recreate the London After Midnight with Cagney there. It must have been for a photo shoot. I'd love to take a look at it. That's kind of cool. There's Laugh Clown Laugh, which is a sort of light version of He Who Gets Slapped. He's in it with Loretta Young, and it's kind of got a creepy, almost awkward feel to it because of the age difference of them. They're doing the what's it, showcasing sort of the end of or the Lon's son into a grown man. And I guess he did go to his father about being an actor, and Lon Chaney wouldn't have any of it. He wouldn't hear any of it. It was literally a case of over his dead body, which we'll see in the end, and what is probably the least accurate moment of the film. But it's just sort of part of the picture. Going back to Mockery and what he did with that part, Lon Chaney. What you see in that movie is what Lon Chaney does in the movie is he showcases sort of the environment and the effect it has on his character. And then he plays Sergei, a Russian peasant in the midst of Bolshevik Russia. He's a peasant and there's a countess, and sort of an unrequited love story in a way. But what the makeup does is that it showcases sort of the environment. You see Chaney carry around the filth and the poverty on his face. He puts a lot of dirt on his hands, and there's a great still from behind the scenes where Chaney's getting into costume, and you see where the character ends and Lon Chaney begins, because you see like the dirt and the extra hair he puts on his hands ends, and then it's completely, his skin's almost white where the arm ends. It's a great still. Here we're having Cleva re-enter the picture, sort of seeking some redemption for herself. This didn't really happen. I guess Lon Chaney Jr. actually did try to get in contact with his mother again, and she said she didn't know him or something like that. That she had no interest in doing it. I mean, it just goes back to this being a bio picture, showcasing this moment. Now, obviously, there isn't a moment that has more dramatic weight than her attempted suicide. It's just too good to waste. And in Lon Chaney's actual will, he left Cleva just $1 single, as sort of the final insult. And one of the ways this film is true is that Lon kept telling his son that his mother was dead, and I guess that's kind of how they talked about her the rest of his life. Here we see Lon's makeup case, which I haven't gotten into, but it actually was very similar to what we see here. I know in the last commentary we talked about the documentary Frankenstein Goes to Hollywood, and in that documentary Mark Gatiss goes to the Museum of Natural History, which Hazel, upon Lon's death, donated all of his tools to the museum. And one of them, of course, is the famous makeup case. And you go there and, I mean, isn't this the worst kicker? It isn't there on display. But it actually does exist. And every bit of his makeup, came from rudimentary pieces from here, and it's really fascinating to think about it. It was just converted box, and it actually does say Lon Chaney, Burbank, California on the top, or Los Angeles, California. I mean, how cool is that? It's really humble to think of the whole thing. It's the greatest artifact of motion picture history. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet, which I regret if we didn't, is that this film itself really perpetuated the legend of Lon Chaney, and the makeup case. This film inspired 3 great makeup artists, and Rick Baker, I guess, saw this movie as a kid, and of course we know Rick Baker from all the great makeups he's done. He's the most Oscar nominated, an Oscar winning makeup artist. He did the wonderful makeup for An American Werewolf in London, Ed Wood, the Planet of the Apes remake, obviously not as great film, but a great makeup, and The Nutty Professor, and The Grinch, and he saw this movie, and just those scenes earlier, like the one where he dresses up as the pirate, certainly inspired him, and just sort of seeing the magic of make-believe. Tom Savini saw this film at the same time too, and that's what inspired him to become a makeup artist. He actually named his sons after Lon Chaney as well. Michael Blake, who's saw this film, and he's become the Chaney guru. I'll probably leave the link in the description box, but there's a wonderful group if you're on Facebook and you're interested in Lon Chaney, where it's just a bunch of Chaney fans sharing information. And like I said, I really recommend checking out Michael Blake's books, because I mean, if you go into this film thinking you're going to learn about Lon Chaney, you'll be severely disappointed. But you want to learn about Lon Chaney as an artist and even as a person. I'd read The Man Behind the Thousand Faces.
Go to him? Get down on my knees to my own son? Beg him? Is that what you asked me to do? That's exactly what I think you should do.
Here we have sort of the nasty aspect of Lon Chaney. We're getting hints that he's dying of lung cancer. The fact is, like, for all the Cheneys, you know, the wonderful things about him, he had a serious problem. He was a horrible smoker, like chain smoker, one after another, and it caught up with him really early in his life. By 46, he knew, by the time he was 46 years old and filming his last talkie, he knew he was terminally ill. When you see The Unholy Three, which they're talking about now, you see, you can tell he's sick. He looks a lot thinner than he actually was the rest of his career. But they thought that Chaney would be able to make the transition to sound and become, in some ways, the man of 1,000 voices. The film that they chose to be Chaney's talkie debut was The Unholy Three, a remake of a Todd Browning film. In the film, Chaney plays a ventriloquist, and it's really a bizarre, convoluted plot. He plays a ventriloquist who owns a pet shop, or he goes into a crime syndicate and owns a pet shop and poses as an old woman. And they sell parrots to the rich customers so they can scout their houses and eventually rob them. It's weirder than it sounds. But Chaney's good in both versions. The silent one's better, though. But his voice, definitely, you could see him having a success in sound pictures. One of the things that a rumor that's very popular is that had Chaney lived, he would have gotten the part in Dracula, and it didn't happen, and it probably wouldn't have happened had he lived, because he was under contract to MGM. But you know, there's some great what if scenarios about Chaney's sound career had he lived. I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with makeup in the sound film, in the sound era, because his extreme silent era makeups, Phantom, Hunchback, and certainly London After Midnight, he wouldn't have been able to do dialogue in a sound film in those makeups, and it would have been interesting. I think he would have been a pretty decent character actor. Paul Muni, who was in Scarface, obviously was billed for a short period of time. as the next Lon Chaney. Universal tried to showcase Bela Lugosi as the next Lon Chaney after Dracula. They definitely did think of Dracula as a Lon Chaney picture. I mean, you almost had to with, you'd almost have to with Todd Browning doing it. And then after Frankenstein, I mean, Karloff was the next obvious choice. And Karloff actually did meet Lon Chaney. It's one of the most famous Karloff stories. You know, Lon was a sweetheart to struggling actors, and he'd always listen to them. You know, obviously he had been there before, and he picks up Boris Karloff from the studio and offers him a ride home. And they get to talking, and Karloff gets one piece of advice from Lon Chaney. You know, find something that other people can't do and do it better than they ever could. I mean, that's wonderful, and it's certainly very sweet. You know, it's a great story, but they tried to find a Lon Chaney, obviously, and I don't think they ever did find one. Chaney was one of a kind. I think the reason I say that there's never another Lon Chaney is because you don't really see these kind of films and these kind of characters where Chaney didn't really play the good guy or bad guy. And you certainly never saw the kind of unrequited lover character that Chaney played again after in quite the same way. But in a lot of ways, like the legacy of Lon Chaney, you know, it keeps changing, and a lot of people buy into Universal's legacy of Lon Chaney, that he was a great horror actor. And I think this film in some ways tries to perpetuate that legacy by really spending some time showcasing the Hunchback and Phantom above all the other pictures, and they certainly were his biggest pictures. But here he's starting to go into his silent sign language as he realizes that he can't speak anymore. This is interesting in they were going into sort of the origins of Creighton Chaney, and how he becomes Lon Chaney Jr. Lon Chaney actually chose Creighton's career. He decided to send him to plumbing school around this time. Lon Jr. was actually married and had a child. Like, Chaney lived to see his first grandchild. And I guess he was looking forward to spoiling him. Right before Chaney died, he signed a 5-year deal with MGM, so they definitely intended for him to be a big sound star. And after he died, the first thing MGM tried to do was get that money back, which is pretty sleazy. And I guess Irving Thalberg made sure that Hazel got to keep all the bonuses that Lon got in initially signing that contract.
She's fine. I think as you know, she's against my leaving. Auctions, we can't farm. We give it 30 men.
One of the things,
I had to take care of it. Yeah, I know. I should have been proud of you. But instead, I kept steaming myself up to stay mad.
one of the things I think you appreciate about Cagney's performance is that even though there are very melodramatic moments, I like this ending where he becomes warm and sort of reverts into his being like his parents, and sort of being vulnerable, and that's really what Lon Chaney did best, and it's Cagney living up to this legacy. Here's probably the most famous moment of this picture. Chaney is on his deathbed, and he can't communicate. He's so sick, but he starts using some sign language, and his last request is to bring his makeup case to Lon, to his bed, so he can this is a sweet moment. Like, it's so sappy, but it's sappy in the best way possible. He takes a piece of chalk here and adds JR to the Lon Chaney on the side of it. And how sweet is that, just knowing how things actually turned out. You wish it was kind of this sentimental and sweet, the only way Lon Creighton Chaney was going to become an actor was over his father's dead body, and it kind of happened that way. But he did eventually get to live his dream. One of the things that you see in some of the interviews I've read is that Creighton really did want to portray the same role as his father did, and he actually wanted to play his own father in this film, from what I've read too, which certainly would have been interesting. He was certainly talented enough to do it, but that wouldn't have happened. Especially when you have Cagney, who was such a huge star. But when Chaney died, he left a void. And when we saw in the beginning of the film, that the entirety of Hollywood actually shut down for a day in memorial to Chaney, and that actually did happen. And how many times has a silent film actor been reenacted in film? This is one of the few, and certainly one of the more memorable. It's got its goofy moments, but I think it reminds you a lot of why Lon Chaney was such a special talent. It's a movie about the magic of making movies, and at its best moments, certainly when you see Chaney get into character, and like at the end, it reminds you that there really is, you really appreciate, I think, Lon Chaney at those moments. And while it isn't a great factual biography, I think it has a lot of heart to it. I used to not really like the picture all that much because I felt that it was melodramatic. And while it certainly is at some moments, like we've gone into that, But I appreciate the movie now in that it really inspired some great people, and it certainly inspired me at the time when I first saw it. I fell in love with it the first time I saw it. It's not a great movie. It's got some great moments in it, and I hope you guys were able to appreciate some of it. I really enjoyed sort of talking about Lon Chaney because really, the movie is a great excuse to learn about Lon Chaney, and I certainly recommend you guys check out Michael Blake's books and Lon Chaney's films. This is really was sort of an excuse for me to go into Lon Chaney, and I imagine we'll look at one of his films. I hope this was a nice change of pace and that you guys had a good time listening to it, because you certainly you think you know Lon Chaney. You think he's this great horror star, and he's a little bit more, and that's what I appreciate about him. Until next time, I hope you guys have a good evening and enjoy. Hello, commentary fans. This is your host, Mike, again, and I am back for the next commentary. And today we're going to do something a tad different, a little similar in spirit, though. We're going to do the James Cagney Lon Chaney biopic, Man of a Thousand Faces, from 1957. It's an interesting movie. It's just kind of a biopic, and it sort of falls into the traps a lot of biopics have. But it's an important movie in the history of kind of the genre films that we all love. And at its best moments, I think it's a pretty interesting look at the times, not necessarily the life of Lon Chaney, but definitely sort of the times he was involved with. It's a film that has inspired a lot of makeup artists, and it certainly inspired me as a kid. It's definitely a movie that loves movie making, and I hope you guys enjoy the commentary. I am paused on the first sort of title screen of the movie, Universal International special release for Hollywood's Golden Jubilee, and I am going to start the picture in 3, 2, and 1. The movie is just beginning. It has Jim Cagney as Lon Chaney, and I don't know how inspired the choice of having Jim Cagney was in the film, just because at this point he's a little too old for the part. The film starts on August 27th, 1930, which we're about to see, and we're going to meet Robert Evans, the famous head of MGM, who produced such classic movies like The Godfather, and he's playing Irving Thalberg, the head of MGM, and it's really kind of fitting, because he, of course, is very much became the next generation's Irving Thalberg, and there's a bust of Lon Chaney at the Phantom of the Opera stage, which is still there on the Universal lot. set actually still exists, which is kind of cool. It's the oldest surviving film set, and the bust is kind of awkward here. It looks like a combination of Lon Chaney and James Cagney, and physically the two men didn't really look all that similar. We just saw the credit for music by Frank Skinner, and we're definitely going to get into his musical score because I think it's one of the worst things about the picture. Irving Thalberg here is kind of giving a they needed to. Chaney was, I've read that he was described as sort of a jack of all trades. He really had to be. He had experience, of course, in clowning, singing, stand-up, comedy, and dancing especially. I've heard he was a great dancer. It's a shame that he didn't do it in any of his movies. Here we have the first instance of Cleva, who is Lon's first life, and she's played here by Dorothy Malone, who's sort of I don't know, I don't think you'd call her a femme fatale, but she's definitely very overdramatic. Her part very hard. And she plays Cleva, Lon's first wife, and I'd have to think that, in adapting Chaney's life to screen, this is one of the things that got sort of lost in the translation. And this part in the movie, Chaney is only about 22 years old, and he's played here by a 57-year-old Cagney, and it's hard to remember that. And Chaney, married Cleva Creighton when she was 15 years old, and she married, she had Lon Chaney Jr., or Creighton Chaney, when she was only 16, and so I'd have to imagine that a lot of the conflict of their marriage had to do with the fact that they were both so young at the time, and the fact that they lived a very odd life. And of course they were traveling across the country, not knowing when the next pay check would be. Lon's parents were deaf mutes, and it's really kind of fascinating to really think about Chaney's upgrading. Lon Chaney, obviously, the ability he had to showcase the sort of different, a lot of people naturally assume that came from knowing what persecution his parents faced. They met when Lon's mother's parents formed a school for the deaf in Colorado Springs, which actually still exists. And Chaney, of course, was proficient in sign language, and a large part of sign language is being able to communicate not only with your hands but with your face. And how perfect is that in becoming an actor. We have Lon's parents here, and they serve as the conflict of the story in terms of the effect that they have on Cleva Creighton and her fear that her son is going to be born deaf mute. And
My mother and father.
I think that's really just a very very simple choice that really plays into melodrama, and it is very disappointing. And it doesn't even work on. I don't think it works in the way that the film intends it to, because you really are encouraged, I'd imagine, to identify with Lon as, what he was, a great voice for the different. But even here, he's not very sympathetic to his first wife. He doesn't tell her that his parents were deaf, and that you could see why someone would be frustrated with that. I mean, I don't think they'd have the reaction that Cleva had, but it is sort of unsympathetic.
All right, let's see now. No prompting. Mom, white meat, Dad, dark and heavy on the gravy. John and Terry, drumsticks or wings, enjoyed because you're the baby of the family. Last part over the fence.
Yeah, here we have the music by Frank Skinner, and it's just way over the top. Like, it goes into these over dramatic cues. Like, it's almost stock. There's like a dun 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 kind of feel to these cues here when Cleva acts up. And then you remember that heroic sort of theme at the beginning of the picture where they introduce Irving Thalberg. It just is really too simple in a way, too predictable, and it just, I think in the long run, it insults the intelligence of an audience. You know what I mean? Like, why would you need this kind of overpowering musical score? I mean, audiences are smart enough. You gotta respect them, and you gotta let them. They have, I'm sorry. You have to be able to use your imagination in a way, and then if you just have this overpowering, it just is really jarring. And Dorothy Malone just goes into eccentric here. She just screams at the top of her lungs, and it just is punctuated with this musical score. It's eulogy about Chaney, and sort of talking in a very romantic viewpoint on acting. Chaney died pretty young, at the age of 47, and I don't think anyone was sort of expecting it. He had been sort of private about his affairs, and he had been dying of lung cancer for about a year. And no, I don't. He was a very private man, which is one of the things sort of going against this picture. You know, we're gonna talk about the biopic because that's certainly they've become a formula. You know what I mean? And pretty much, I think every biopic sort of does either two things. They look for the negative aspects of the character. I know a biopic that was pretty recent and pretty successful was the Johnny Cash biopic, Walk the Line, and I use it as sort of a template because it is one of the most successful biopics, but it falls into these traps. You know, it is only concerned about the sex life and the demons of the person. And of course, you know, that is only one aspect of someone's life. If you focus too much on that, you don't get a sense of who the person really was. And this movie falls into that trap. It focuses on Chaney's demons, and I sort of use that in loose form because Chaney's demons in this picture really have to do with one thing: the fact that he was born to deaf-mute parents in Colorado, and it's an important part of Chaney's life. Don't get me wrong; it's definitely shaped him as a man and as an actor, but it's definitely, Lon Chaney was more than that, and the movie, I think, tries to show Chaney as sympathetic and you know, this great kind of this great voice for the different, and he certainly was, don't get me wrong, but unlike Lon Chaney, I don't quite think this movie respects what it is to be different in a way. I think it ostracizes different people in the guise of celebrating them. And that's not what Lon Chaney was. Here are the best moments of the movie. I guess in one way you can say that James Cagney was a good choice to play Lon Chaney because both men had a very similar background in terms of building themselves as artists. Chaney and Cagney had a great amount of vaudeville experience, and you certainly see that Cagney is right at home in this moment, playing the clown on the stage, and Cagney also has a great use of pantomime. His face here is incredible. He's a good clown, I think, in these two sequences on the vaudeville stage because there's a tragic nature to this clown as well. Chaney, of course, was sort of certainly had experience in clowning. I'd imagine he did do a great amount of it on the vaudeville stage, but in my opinion, his best film is a picture called He Who Gets Slapped, which is an adaptation of the Russian play. And Chaney plays a take on the Pagliacci myth. And there are moments in that movie that really make you laugh and cry at the same time. And it shows the fact that it takes a lot of dignity to play a clown, because they are sort of pathetic in some ways. Here we have Cagney. His mannequin has fallen down, and the bit ends with a big frown on his face.
Here, it's yours. You can have it.
Lon Chaney traveled the country going from vaudeville theater to vaudeville theater, and I like the opening of this picture because it shows kind of this dire straits some of these performers had. You know, they really had to be committed to their craft, because often they'd be paid in peanuts, like Cagney says they're potato peelings, and what he says here is that they need to find other shows. Vaudeville was the popular form of entertainment at the time, of course, because this takes place before motion pictures. And so every sort of theater, I mean every sort of town would have a vaudeville act come through. And that's how Chaney got started and made a name for himself. And, you know, you look at Lon Chaney and Jim Cagney even, and you see that when they came to their motion picture career, they kind of found themselves stuck in one thing, you know. Chaney playing these misfits and Cagney playing these hard-edged tough guys, and you know, both of them had range because